When my sister handed me the new lease, her pen tapping impatiently against the page, I read the number once, twice, and then a third time, making sure my eyes weren't betraying me. $6,800. Rent. For the same one-bedroom apartment I had been living in quietly, paying my bills on time, bothering no one. She had tripled it overnight without a flicker of hesitation. Most people would have exploded, would have shouted across the table, would have demanded an explanation. But I didn't. I simply folded the paper back into its envelope, placed it neatly in front of me, and looked up at her steady gaze. Inside, something icy clicked into place. This was no mistake. This was her final move in a game she had been playing since childhood. If you have ever sat at a family dinner, knowing every smile is a mask, every word is measured, you will understand why I must tell this story. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 42 years old, and I have spent a lifetime living in the shadow of my sister, Amanda. Some people tell stories to get sympathy, to beg for pity. That is not what I am doing. I am telling this because silence is heavy, and I have carried that weight for too long. Sometimes the only way to stay sane is to lay the truth bare, no matter how ugly it looks under the light. Amanda was the firstborn, the golden one. From the moment she opened her mouth as a child, my parents treated her voice like scripture. Her smallest victories were paraded as proof of her brilliance. A spelling bee ribbon in 3rd grade was enough to summon relatives for cake and champagne. When she made the junior varsity cheer team, my father bought her a car. When she got into a state college, there were banners, balloons, and a celebration that looked more like a wedding than a graduation. And me? The quiet second daughter, the one who never demanded much, who kept her head down and did the work no one noticed. My report cards lined with straight A's were brushed off with a tired smile and a nod. Evelyn is steady, my mother would say, as though steadiness was a flaw. When I placed first in the county debate championship, the story told at the dinner table wasn't about me, but about Amanda's boyfriend of the month and how handsome he looked in his varsity jacket. It didn't stop with childhood. The pattern stretched like a shadow over every stage of my life. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was 22, newly graduated with honors, and offered my first position at a financial firm downtown. I arrived home proud, finally hoping my hard work would mean something. Amanda arrived 10 minutes later, holding a flyer for a yoga class she had signed up for. My parents spent the entire evening discussing the benefits of deep breathing, while my news sank into the mashed potatoes and gravy, untouched and forgotten. That was the rhythm of my existence. I gave, I built, I achieved, and Amanda eclipsed it with the most trivial gestures. I learned to stop trying to shine. I learned to survive by becoming invisible. Years passed. I built a life outside their gaze, carefully, quietly. I worked long hours, saved every cent, learned where to put money so that it grew even while I slept. Real estate became my refuge, my shield. I studied contracts while others scrolled through television channels. I walked through abandoned buildings when others wasted weekends at the mall. And piece by piece, I built something Amanda never suspected. But I told no one. Not my parents, not Amanda, not even close friends. Secrecy became my armor. Because I knew, deep in my bones, that if Amanda sensed even a fraction of what I had, she would find a way to claim it, twist it, use it as a weapon. My entire life had taught me that much. And so, a year ago, when I rented one of the apartments in a building managed by Amanda, I thought I could do it quietly, blending into the rows of tenants unnoticed. I signed the lease, paid the rent promptly, kept the place spotless. I was, in every sense of the word, a model tenant. But Amanda was never satisfied with order. She craved control. It was only a matter of time before she came knocking, smiling that thin, rehearsed smile that had fooled our parents for decades. She handed me the new lease as if it were a gift, her manicured nails tapping against the inflated numbers. "Costs have gone up," she said casually, as though tripling someone's rent overnight was the most natural thing in the world. $6,800. For an apartment barely 800 square feet, with cracked tile in the bathroom and a leaky faucet in the kitchen. I could have told her no. I could have told her it was illegal, extortionate, absurd. But something inside me whispered, "Wait, don't reveal anything yet. Let her believe she has won. Let her walk into her own trap." And so I stayed calm. I looked her in the eye, gave a small nod, and slid the envelope back across the table. She mistook my silence for defeat. She always had. That was her greatest weakness. Amanda believed stillness meant surrender, when in truth it meant calculation. I'm telling you this now because stories like mine rarely get told. Families like mine prefer silence, sweeping the cruelty under starched tablecloths and holiday greetings. But silence hides the truth, and truth, once buried too long, begins to rot. This is not a story about money, not really. It is a story about power, about what happens when you spend your entire life underestimated by the people who should have loved you most. I stayed calm that day, not because I was weak, but because I already knew how this story would end. And when Amanda's face turned pale, when she finally realized whose name was written on the deeds and contracts she had ignored for years, that was the first time in my life I saw her speechless. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how we arrived at that moment, how a single sheet of paper with $6,800 printed across it became the spark for a reckoning decades in the making, you have to go back with me. Back to the beginning. Back to the girl who sat at the family table with her head bowed, who learned that silence was safer than shouting, who taught herself to endure until the day she no longer had to. That girl was me. That girl is still here, speaking at last. When I look back at the years that shaped me, I realize my sister Amanda didn't need to raise her voice to keep me small. She had an entire family doing that work for her. I was the background, the filler, the reliable one. My parents used to say, "Evelyn will be fine on her own," as though being fine meant I didn't deserve comfort or recognition. And so the years blurred into one another, each one teaching me that my role was to endure, not to shine. I became practiced at it, the art of swallowing disappointment without a sound. I became an expert at fading into corners, watching Amanda soak in the spotlight as if it belonged to her by divine right. I remember the nights most vividly. Around the dinner table, Amanda's story stretched long into the evening, while my words slipped unnoticed into silence. I would mention a paper I had written that earned the highest grade in the class, and my father would nod, distracted, already turning to ask Amanda about her weekend plans. Once, when I came home holding a certificate from a state science fair, my mother brushed past me, her hands full of shopping bags, eager to show Amanda the new dress she had bought her. The certificate curled in my hand, forgotten, as though knowledge weighed less than fabric. Over time, I stopped holding up certificates. I stopped trying to announce victories. I learned that recognition was a privilege reserved for someone else. It might sound strange, but the very things that erased me also forged me. With no applause, I became my own audience. With no safety net, I became my own rescuer. While Amanda's mistakes were softened by excuses, mine became lessons I had to learn quickly, silently, without guidance. I built discipline from the scraps of neglect. I turned loneliness into focus. And while Amanda wasted hours rehearsing for parties or polishing her charm for the next boyfriend, I was reading, planning, calculating what life might look like if I carved it myself. One winter evening stands out even now. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasted meat. Christmas Eve had always been Amanda's stage. She unwrapped a necklace from my parents, her face glowing under the twinkling lights, while I sat with a small box containing socks. My father clapped his hands and said, "Amanda deserves it. She's had a stressful semester." I had completed a full internship that fall, working 40 hours a week while keeping my grades spotless, but not a word was said about that. As Amanda leaned across the table to show her necklace, her voice carried above the carols playing on the radio. My voice, when I whispered thank you for the socks, was drowned out completely. That was my childhood in a single frame. The glow of her, the silence of me. College was no different. Amanda stayed close to home, drifting through classes, while I moved across the state and lived on scholarships I earned through relentless work. I sent postcards, called, tried to keep ties. Most of the time, no one picked up. When they did, the conversations were short, cut off by Amanda's interruptions or my mother's insistence that Amanda needed help with something urgent. I was 20, sitting alone in a cramped dorm room with textbooks piled high, listening to the quiet thrum of a radiator while my family gathered around Amanda's laughter back home. I didn't resent her then. I told myself this was just the way it was, that some people drew attention like gravity, while others had to fight for every glance. But beneath my calm exterior, something else was growing. A determination sharper than bitterness. If no one was going to hand me the life I wanted, I would build it in silence. I worked 2 jobs through college, stacked shifts at the library and the diner, saved every spare dollar. When Amanda boasted about new shoes, I bought shares in companies she had never heard of. When she went on vacations my parents funded, I studied housing markets and walked neighborhoods with for sale signs, taking notes. I became obsessed not with revenge, but with control. The kind of control that could not be stripped away with a careless laugh or a cruel dismissal. Every late night with tired eyes, every paycheck carefully divided between bills and savings, every notebook filled with plans, that was me laying bricks, one by one, for a foundation no one else could touch. By the time I turned 30, Amanda was already on her second divorce, each one cushioned by my parents' resources. She had never paid a full bill in her life, never worried about whether she could make rent, never known the heavy stillness of staring at an empty fridge. I had lived all of that and survived. And in surviving, I discovered strength. I bought my first property, a small duplex, worn down but standing. It didn't look like much to anyone else, but to me it was proof that I could shape my own world. I managed the repairs myself, painted the walls, replaced the doors, and when the first tenants moved in, handing me their rent checks, I felt something Amanda had never known. The satisfaction of earning without permission, of being seen without begging. This is why the moment she tried to triple my rent didn't break me. It confirmed everything I already knew. Amanda had never stopped underestimating me. She saw me as the same quiet shadow, the same invisible sister she had buried beneath her shine for decades. What she didn't know was that every year of silence, every overlooked victory, every empty chair I had sat at had only fueled me. While she was busy polishing her reflection in the family's eyes, I had been building something real. And soon, very soon, she would discover the cost of her arrogance. For now, I let her believe the story she had always told herself, that Evelyn would endure anything. What she didn't realize was that endurance had become my greatest weapon. The day Amanda made her move, the air felt charged before a single word was spoken. I had been living in the apartment for nearly a year, quietly, paying on time, never giving her reason to complain. I thought perhaps, foolishly, that she might finally leave me alone. But Amanda never missed an opportunity to remind me of my place. She arrived unannounced, her heels clicking against the floor like a metronome of arrogance, holding an envelope in her hand. She slid it across the kitchen table with a smile that never touched her eyes. "Market rates are changing," she said lightly, as though she were doing me a favor. "This is just business, Evelyn. You understand." I opened the envelope. The number stared back at me. $6,800. Not for a luxury penthouse, not for a sprawling loft, but for the same tired one-bedroom I had been renting at $2,200 a month. The cracked bathroom tile was still there. The radiator still hissed in the night. The faucet still leaked into the sink, drop by drop. Nothing had changed, except Amanda's greed. I remember the way my chest tightened, the way my breath slowed. She was daring me to react, craving the satisfaction of watching me lose composure. I met her gaze and gave her nothing. "That's quite an increase," I said evenly. She tilted her head, feigning sympathy. "Life is expensive, Evie. Maybe this place isn't right for you anymore. Maybe you should start looking elsewhere." She said it with such casual cruelty that for a moment I almost admired her precision. Every word had been sharpened to pierce. She wanted me gone, not because she needed the money, but because she wanted proof that she still controlled me, that I would always be the shadow scrambling beneath her shine. My silence unnerved her. She expected pleading, excuses, anger. Instead, I set the paper back on the table, folded carefully along its creases. "I'll think about it," I replied. For a flicker of a second, doubt crossed her face. Then she smoothed it away, satisfied enough with her performance to believe she had already won. After she left, I sat alone in the dim light of the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence as I stared at the lease. My hands didn't shake. My mind didn't spin. I felt only a strange calm, the kind that comes when the final piece of a puzzle slips into place. Amanda thought she had written the ending of my story. What she didn't know was that the story had been mine all along. Over the next few days, Amanda paraded her supposed victory. She mentioned to our parents that she had adjusted things with my lease, laughing as though it were a clever joke. Evelyn never could keep up, she told them, her voice dripping with condescension. I wouldn't be surprised if she's gone by the end of the month. My parents chuckled politely, choosing not to see the cruelty, just as they always had. I listened in silence, present at the same dinner table where I had once swallowed humiliation as a child. But this time, I wasn't swallowing anything. I was waiting. Amanda, blinded by her own triumph, grew bolder. She started talking about renovations, about how she might use my apartment once I was gone. She spoke as though I were already a ghost, as though I had no claim, no weight, no permanence. She called contractors, walked them through the building, pointed at walls she wanted knocked down. I overheard her once in the hallway, laughing into her phone. By next year, that whole floor will be mine. Each word was another nail sealing her own fate. I didn't interrupt. I didn't warn her. I let her build her illusions brick by brick, high enough that the fall would break her. At night, I would sit by the window of my apartment, watching the city lights flicker. In those moments, memories rose uninvited. The birthday party where everyone forgot my cake, the graduation where Amanda's half-hearted certificate drew cheers while my honors passed unnoticed, the Christmas socks beside her diamond necklace. Each memory settled into me like stone, heavy but grounding. This wasn't just about rent. This was about every dismissal, every smirk, every year I had been told without words that I was less. Now Amanda had handed me the stage she never believed I could hold. The irony made me smile. The turning point came one Saturday evening at a family dinner. Amanda was in her element, swirling a glass of wine, recounting stories about her business savvy. She bragged about the rent hike as though it were a clever business deal, making jokes about how poor Evelyn might need to start couch surfing. Laughter scattered around the table, some uneasy, some indulgent. I let it roll over me, my face composed, my heart steady. When the moment was right, I set my glass down and reached into my bag. A single folder rested there, thick with papers, deeds, contracts, everything I had spent years assembling in silence. I slid it onto the table and opened it with deliberate calm. Since we're talking about the building, I said softly, you should probably know who actually owns it. The room stilled. Amanda blinked, confusion flickering across her face. What are you talking about? I pushed the documents toward her. Read. She hesitated, then scanned the page. Her lips parted, the color draining from her cheeks. My parents leaned in, brows furrowed, trying to make sense of the legal language. And then it hit them all at once. The building, the very one Amanda claimed to control, was mine. Every brick, every lease, every unit. I had bought it quietly, years ago, while Amanda was too busy chasing attention to notice. Silence swallowed the room. Amanda looked up at me, pale, her practiced smile gone. For the first time in my life, she had nothing to say, and I, for the first time, had no need to explain. I simply sat there, calm, steady, the way they had always described me. Only now, steadiness wasn't weakness. It was power. Amanda's silence that night was more deafening than any outburst she could have delivered. For once, her voice, so often the loudest in the room, was trapped behind clenched teeth and pale lips. My parents stared at the papers, their eyes darting between the legal seals and my steady face, as though the world they thought they understood had been quietly rewritten when they weren't paying attention. I let the silence stretch. It was the kind of silence that forces people to face themselves. Amanda shifted in her chair, her usual poise unraveling in small betrayals, her fingers tapping nervously against her wine glass, the way her throat worked as she swallowed hard, the flush creeping up her neck. This isn't possible, she finally managed, her voice thin. You couldn't have bought the building. You don't have the money for that. I tilted my head, calm, almost curious. And yet, I said softly, you're sitting in front of the documents that say otherwise. My father cleared his throat, but the sound faltered before it became words. My mother leaned back, clutching her glass as if it could anchor her. Amanda's denial tumbled out quickly, almost desperate. It must be a mistake. Evelyn doesn't know anything about real estate. She can't even. She stopped herself, but I saw the words she almost said. Can't even manage her own life. That was always the narrative, wasn't it? Evelyn the steady shadow. Evelyn the invisible one. Evelyn who would survive but never succeed. I folded my hands on the table and let her crumble against her own disbelief. The truth didn't need defending. It stood taller than any argument she could summon. My parents exchanged looks, the kind that carried decades of complicity. They had believed Amanda's version of reality for so long that this revelation cut deeper than just finances. It revealed their blindness, their willingness to ignore me because it was easier to worship her shine. I didn't need to remind them of that. The weight was already settling into their expressions. Amanda tried again, her voice rising in pitch. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why keep this a secret? I let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Because I wanted to see how you would treat me when you thought I had nothing. And you didn't disappoint. My words landed heavier than any raised voice. Amanda flinched as if I had struck her, though my tone never shifted from its calm steadiness. I thought of all the years I had been told to be quiet, to be grateful, to stay in my place. Now, my silence had become the very weapon they couldn't defend against. The dinner carried on in strained fragments after that, though no one truly ate. Forks scraped plates without appetite, glasses were filled but left untouched. Amanda tried to steer the conversation back to trivialities, fashion, friends, her latest plans, but the effort fell flat. Every word seemed hollow under the weight of what had been revealed. For once, her spotlight had been shattered, and the shards reflected her own face back at her. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave, Amanda cornered me near the coat rack. Her voice was a hiss, sharp but trembling. You humiliated me. In front of everyone. Do you know what you've done? I met her fury with quiet. I didn't humiliate you, Amanda. You did that yourself when you chose arrogance over respect. She recoiled as though my calmness was more cutting than if I had shouted. That was the truth of it. She thrived on conflict, on spectacle. Deny her that, and she was powerless. Driving home that night, the city lights blurred against the windshield. I thought about how different this confrontation had felt from the countless arguments of our past. As children, I had always walked away wounded, diminished. This time I walked away intact, my dignity not just preserved but affirmed. Amanda's pale face replayed in my mind, not because I delighted in her discomfort, but because it symbolized a shift decades overdue. I had not needed to scream or beg or fight. All I had needed was the truth, revealed at the right moment, and it had spoken louder than anything else. In the days that followed, word spread quietly through the family. Cousins called, some out of curiosity, others with a strange respect in their voices. We never knew Evelyn, one aunt confessed during a phone call. We always thought you were just ordinary. I smiled faintly, joy in it. Ordinary had been the mask I wore while I built something extraordinary. Amanda avoided me, her pride too fragile to endure proximity, but her absence was louder than her presence had ever been. It confirmed what I already knew. She had no power left to wield. My parents were slower to adjust. They tried to stitch together old habits, inviting Amanda over more often, pretending nothing had changed, but their eyes betrayed them. They watched me differently now, with hesitation, with questions they didn't know how to ask. For once, I wasn't the one shrinking under their gaze. I wasn't sure if their discomfort was regret or merely the shock of a new reality. But I didn't care enough to untangle it. The truth had already done its work. Amanda had asked me why I stayed silent all those years. The answer was simple. Silence had been survival. But now silence was choice. And in that choice lay a power I never expected to feel. I no longer needed their recognition. I no longer needed their approval. The truth was mine, and it was enough. Amanda's downfall didn't arrive in a single dramatic collapse. It unfolded slowly, like a thread unraveling from the edge of a garment, each day tugging a little more until the whole thing came apart. After that dinner, her confidence cracked. She tried to pretend nothing had changed, tried to act as though the building was still hers to control, but every interaction betrayed her. Tenants who once flattered her now bypassed her completely, coming directly to me with their concerns. Contractors she had boasted about hiring stopped returning her calls once they learned her name carried no authority. Even the tone of our parents shifted. They no longer spoke of Amanda as the untouchable daughter. Their voices carried hesitation, laced with uncertainty whenever her name came up. Amanda, for the first time, was being forced to live in a reality where her word was not law. The more she flailed, the more transparent her desperation became. She showed up at the building unannounced, strutting through the halls as though trying to remind everyone she still belonged. But the tenants, who had once endured her condescension because they believed she held the keys, now looked at her with thinly veiled amusement. One afternoon, I found her berating a maintenance worker about a leaky faucet. When she saw me, her voice faltered, her cheeks burning red. She muttered an excuse and left quickly, heels clattering down the stairs. She wasn't used to being powerless, and it showed. Her social circle noticed too. Amanda had always thrived on appearances, hosting dinners she couldn't afford, buying designer clothes on credit, presenting herself as a successful landlord. That identity had been her crown. But gossip has a way of moving faster than truth, and soon whispers reached her friends. They learned that the empire she flaunted was never hers. Invitations grew scarce. People she once called allies stopped picking up her calls. The spotlight that had followed her all her life dimmed, leaving her exposed in the shadows she had always feared. Meanwhile, I didn't have to lift a finger. My silence remained intact, my steps deliberate. I didn't need to humiliate her further. The truth was doing the work for me. She spiraled on her own, cornered by the reality she could no longer bend. It was as if every careless slight, every cruel laugh, every dismissal she had ever cast my way was returning to her, magnified. The moment that sealed it came a few weeks later at another family gathering. Amanda arrived, overdressed as usual, her smile too bright, her laugh too forced. She tried to reclaim the room, launching into a story about a new business venture she was considering. But halfway through, my uncle interrupted, asking me about the building, about how I had managed to grow it quietly into something stable and profitable. All eyes shifted toward me. For once, Amanda was not the center. She tried to interject, to steer the conversation back to herself. But the more she spoke, the clearer it became that she had nothing of substance to offer. Her words were thin, her performance transparent. And then, in a moment I will never forget, my father, who had spent a lifetime praising her every trivial success, turned to her and said flatly, "Amanda, maybe it's time you learned something from your sister." Her face froze, the smile sliding off as if someone had pulled a mask away. The color drained from her cheeks, her eyes wide and glassy. She excused herself from the table soon after, retreating to the bathroom where she stayed for the rest of the evening. The silence that followed her absence was heavy, but no one rushed to fill it. No one chased after her. For the first time, the family had seen through her shine, and they didn't bother pretending otherwise. I drove home that night without triumph swelling in my chest. What I felt was something quieter, something deeper. This wasn't about revenge. It was about balance finally being restored after decades of imbalance. Amanda wasn't ruined by my hand. She was undone by her own arrogance, her refusal to see me as anything more than a shadow. And now, stripped of the illusion, she had nothing left to stand on. In the weeks that followed, Amanda's life seemed to shrink. Her credit card stopped working. The friends who once filled her weekends disappeared. She no longer walked with the same swagger, no longer spoke with the same certainty. When I passed her in the hallway of our parents' house one afternoon, she didn't even lift her eyes. For Amanda, silence was unbearable. Yet now silence was all she received. The greatest irony was this: the girl who had always needed attention, who had been raised to believe the world revolved around her, was now invisible. And me, the sister she had dismissed, belittled, underestimated, was no longer seeking to be seen. I had built something solid, something lasting, without needing their applause. That was the true victory. Amanda had asked once, in anger, why I had stayed silent for so long. The answer was etched in the years she chose to ignore. Silence had been my shield. But in the end, silence became her punishment. And as she sat in the quiet she had mocked me for enduring, I understood the full weight of justice. It doesn't always come loudly, wrapped in fury or spectacle. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a shadow stretching across the floor, inevitable and undeniable. And Amanda, pale and shrinking in that silence, finally learned what it felt like to live in my world. The difference was that I had survived it. She could not. In the weeks after Amanda's world began to unravel, I found myself walking through life with a strange new calm. It wasn't the silence of being ignored, the kind I had lived with for decades, but the silence of release. For years, I had carried the weight of invisibility, the ache of being dismissed, the sting of being told without words that I was less. Now, for the first time, I wasn't carrying any of it. Amanda had tried to strip me of stability, to triple my rent, and push me out as if I were disposable. But in the end, she had only revealed what she feared most, that I had built something stronger than her illusions. Our family gatherings felt different now. The same people who once looked through me now studied me with hesitant respect. Their questions shifted, not toward Amanda's endless stories, but toward me about the building, about how I had kept everything so quiet, about what I planned for the future. Amanda often sat stiffly in those moments, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes darting anywhere but toward me. For someone who had thrived on being the center of attention, being pushed to the margins was its own punishment. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Watching her sit in the shadows I had once occupied was proof enough that life had turned. There were moments when Amanda tried to claw her way back. She would post exaggerated stories online, brag about ventures that didn't exist, try to stir sympathy by painting herself as the victim of circumstance. But those who once believed her had grown cautious. They had seen her mask slip. They knew now that much of what she flaunted was built on air. Lies have a short lifespan once truth steps into the room, and my truth had already spoken for itself. I realized then that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the way people stop laughing at cruel jokes, in the way conversations shift away from the loudest voice, in the way silence settles where arrogance once thrived. That was Amanda's undoing. She couldn't exist without applause. And when the applause stopped, so did she. For me, freedom meant something simple. It was walking into my apartment and knowing I didn't have to answer to her anymore. It was signing papers for new investments without needing permission or validation. It was sitting alone on a balcony, watching the city stretch out under the night sky, and realizing I felt no bitterness, no hunger for revenge, only peace. That was the life I had carved out for myself, brick by brick, in the years when no one was watching. If there's one lesson I want you to take from my story, it is this. Being underestimated can be a gift. The years people dismiss you are the years you can build in silence. Every ignored success, every overlooked effort, every cruel dismissal can be turned into fuel. Let them underestimate you. Let them laugh. Let them write you off. Because one day, when the truth finally rises, it won't need explanation. It will stand on its own, undeniable. And those who thought you were invisible will find themselves blinded by what they refuse to see. I know some of you listening have lived your own version of this story. Maybe you've been the forgotten one at the dinner table. Maybe your voice has been drowned out by someone louder, someone favored. Maybe you've been told you are steady, ordinary, forgettable. I want you to hear me clearly. You are not invisible. You are preparing. And when your time comes, you will not need to shout to be heard. You will simply stand, and the truth will speak for you. As for Amanda, I no longer feel anger toward her. What I feel is distance, the kind that can't be crossed again. She had written me off as invisible for so long that she never imagined the day would come when she would fade instead. I don't need her apology. I don't need her acknowledgement. My closure comes from knowing that I am free of her hold, free of the family's blind devotion, free to live without chains. That is enough. And if my story has spoken to you, if you found pieces of yourself in my silence, then stay with me. There are more stories like mine, stories of quiet endurance, hidden strength, and late but certain justice. Subscribe, not for me, but for yourself. Subscribe so you don't forget that power doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes softly, in the quiet of patience, in the strength of survival, in the calm that follows a storm. Because in the end, the most powerful voice is the one that no longer needs to beg to be heard.